denying elections from left and right, or basically denying the legitimacy of elections from the left and from the right.
Hmm.
So obviously, the 2016 through 2020 saw the Trump Russia investigations with Robert Mueller, who was the guy who prosecuted, who did the Enron case, as far as I'm aware, and a crack team of lawyers. And after several years, they found basically like very little evidence that there was anything there. And after the left spending a long time saying that Trump was not a legitimate president, they then, in 2020, when the election rolled around and some conservatives, or well, a lot of conservatives, had questions about whether it was a legitimate election, um, called them election deniers and said that they were, destroying the fabric of the country. Um, and a lot of people on left and right, depending on the election year and who won, have argued about the integrity of U.S. elections, specifically relating to voting machines and like how vulnerable they are. Like there's
Hmm.
hackathons where people yeah, they prove they can crack into it in a matter of minutes. They're running on the tech that they upgraded after the Bush Gore like debacle in 2000, and they haven't like done any upgrades since. And I looked at the 2021 and I was like, well, I don't know what happened, right? Some weird stuff, but I don't know, right? Like, do you know what I'd love? I'd love a big investigation. And then after that, you spend as much money as you possibly can to ensure that there is no questions about the next election. None. And yet nothing like that happened, and I'm sure people like had the same queries. I didn't know specifically, but in 2016, in 2000, I mean, you can go, I'm sure there's loads and loads of examples. And why do you think this has occurred, and why do you think people are so blinded by their side in terms of like questioning elections?
Yeah, I think that was one of the most important sections in the book and the hardest one to write because I mean I really did want to make a case of whether you're whatever your political beliefs are, examining how your us versus them animosity can bias you, and to examine. I mean, I think it's important to examine that making a claim that an election was illegitimate is a very serious claim, like theoretically a country destroying claim, and and I think not enough people take that seriously because you just see people willing to confidently say an election was rigged with very little evidence. And I've talked to people, I've talked to conservatives because I was curious to research that on my own, and I've seen people say things like, "Oh, I'm certain it was rigged," and I was like, "Well, what really, what's the main evidence you would point to?" And it just seemed really lacking. And I'm like, you see why, just as you would not like liberals to do these things, maybe it's bad to confidently say that you're certain an election was rigged when you don't really seem to be able to point too much that you're confident in it. But I think, I try to make the case, and it gets me grief, from for all this stuff. It gets me grief and criticisms from both sides, because what I'm trying to say is examine the underlying reasons for how conflict naturally makes us distrust elections. And I spent a good amount of time on the liberal side, calling the 2016 election illegitimate because, and I examined my reasons for why I think that is such a bad and wrong claim and dangerous claim, because I think I do that for a few reasons. I think both sides need to examine the unreasonable aspects of what they're doing there. And I've talked to a lot of liberals who kind of just don't even see the equivalence. They're like, well, there was, Russia tried to, tried to manipulate the election, and I'm like, well, there's studies that show that it was like a drop in the bucket. So like even it's not even clear that I don't believe, and many other people do not believe, that they actually succeeded in changing it. But let's even suppose that they did. Like let's even say, even worst case scenario, calling an election illegitimate because an enemy of the United States attempted to manipulate it is just like a fundamentally losing, like game theory bad thing to do because it basically rewards anybody for trying to manipulate your election. So, and I actually think that the reason Russia did what they did is just to create more distrust in elections, right? It's like they didn't, you would have to actually do so much more to actually feel like you've actually, changed an election. But I think that the main thing that they got out of it was like many people calling an election illegitimate. Like that is a destabilizing force much more than like thinking you could actually shift an election, right? So I think, if you're going to say like, hey, some foreign groups are spreading information we think is wrong, that's a reason to call an election illegitimate. Like there's all sorts of misinformation and bad information all over the place. Like we had domestic people making bad information. We had, you could make the argument that a lot of the mainstream coverage is wrong, and that's what the conservatives see. You can make an argument that like these Macedonian people that were motivated by financial incentives were producing a lot of fake news to get clicks and get income. Like there's all sorts of ways we could say our election was tainted by bad information. Like it's always been that way. Go back the history of the United States or any country, it's full of stuff that we could say is bad information. If you're going to use that to call an election illegitimate, like you'll never be able to call another election legitimate because you'll be like, hey, look at this bad information and how it could have shifted the election. It's just like a fundamentally losing proposition to take that stance, right? So I think, and that kind of overlaps with the some of the conservative, Trump voter views, because it's like they would say like, well, the media did this and this and this, and that's why I'm going to call the election illegitimate. It's like the media is always doing stuff that people will disagree with. Like they're doing bad journalism, or they're doing, the social media platforms are doing something we don't agree with. And, if you could reverse the tables and imagine a conservative dominant society doing some similar things and some liberals using that to say, oh, the election was illegitimate because I disagreed with what the media and was doing in this regard. So I think for me it's about like trying to take a wider view and say, can we examine how these us versus them narratives and emotions really bias us and get us to, in the same way we were talking about for too pessimistic framings, it's like we're too likely to say like, I don't like what happened, I don't trust the other side, therefore I'm going to say the election was rigged. Or even taking the stance of like, hey, the election, something could have happened with it, is a more mature stance than saying I am confident the election was illegitimate, right? There's a world of difference there. But I think our emotions make us more likely to reach for these like very certain framings. So like I'm certain this is what happened because XYZ. But I don't know if that helps illuminate it. But that's, I just think getting back to that, it's good to examine the roots of our conflict and good to bring a little skepticism to our us versus them narratives.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. Like, and I tried to say this to people at the time, but like I was like, look, right, after the 2020 election, and it was like, look, like 30-40% of the country of American citizens believe that there's something screwy with that election. Like if you want the country to like not be horrendously divided forever, you need to have an investigation. You need to like, or you need to do something. Yeah.
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, I can see the argument. Like, I do believe in like trying to take the other side's concerns seriously. I don't think we do that enough. Like with this imaginary speech I wrote for Biden, it's like I think we need to engage more with the other side's beliefs, even when we think they're unfounded or even stupid. It's like we do too much denigration or insulting of the other group. So to your point, I think there is some value there, and for example, acknowledging that a majority of Americans, even majority of Democrats in surveys, like supported the idea of voter ID, like requiring ID to vote. So it's like, but some liberals don't want to examine that nuance, or that there might be some things we could do that many people agree with, right? That would set people at ease a little bit more. But to your point too, it's like, if we reversed it and like, a lot of Democrats thought that Trump was an illegitimate president, and they would probably balk at suggestions that they needed to do an investigation just because a large percentage of, I mean, they did do it, but like we should be willing to examine like how we'd feel if the tables were reversed and be like, well, I can kind of see why they don't want to do it, because we probably wouldn't want to do it in the opposite case, right? So,
hey everyone, thanks for making it right the way to the end of the podcast. I love that you tuned in this long. Do me a favor, hit subscribe, because 80% of you bastards are not subscribing, but you're watching my videos. See you next time.